Commissioners, let the record reflect Commissioner Young and Vice Chair Rubin have a conflict on item number 12. We'll step out very briefly. And they have stepped out of the chamber. Commissioners, any question on this item before we move on to WOCAP? This has been briefed before. Any questions? Okay, no questions. Let the record reflect that Commissioner Young and Vice Chair Rubin will be stepping back in. In fact, they are. Commissioners, let's move on to our last item. It's the West Oak Cliff Area Plan. I see that Mr. Church is online. Good afternoon, sir. Just an FYI, we do have a hard stop at 1:45, Daniel, so if you could just keep that in mind. Good afternoon. We can't hear you, Daniel.
Now
we can't. Thank you.
You can hear me? Perfect.
Yes, we can.
All right. Let me. All right. Good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you and give you an update on the West Oak Cliff Area Plan. My name is Daniel Church. I'm a planning supervisor in the Planning and Urban Design Department, and I've been the project manager on the West Oak Cliff Area Plan for the last 27 months. So today, I'm just gonna, I know that we're short on time, so I'm gonna do my best to kind of hit the highlights. I'll give some background as to why the plan has occurred. I'll talk about the engagement effort that we've done over the last 2 years. I'll briefly touch on the plan's goals and the framework and some of the recommendations. I'll talk about what the Comprehensive Land Use Committee, it's been briefed to that committee multiple times, and their influence on the plan and changes that we've made based on their input. And then I'll talk about next steps. So just to kind of wind back the clock to 2019, in 2019, the city changed the authorized hearing process. It used to be first come, first serve. Now it's based on scoring criteria, and one of the highest scoring criteria is having an adopted area plan. So this is an area of Dallas in the southwestern quadrant of the city. It's about a 5 square mile area bounded by Davis, Tyler and Vernon, Illinois, and Cockrell Hill. Before the change in the authorized hearing process, 5 separate authorized hearings had been filed by City Council and City Plan Commission. And so in order to advance those forward, Councilmember Chad West initiated the West Oak Cliff Area Plan, working with Planning and Urban Design to be the lead project coordinator for that planning effort. So as I mentioned, it is in the southwestern area of the city, about 5 square miles, roughly 44,000 residents, and 86% of those residents are Hispanic. So a little bit of why the plan is being done. As I mentioned, there are those 5 authorized hearings. Those are the areas that you see on the map in purple. Again, those were filed before the area plan process started. So it's critical that the area plan help inform and create the foundation through engagement to inform those authorized hearing processes. But beyond that, this is an area that we know is experiencing a lot of development pressure because of the growth and change that's occurred nearby in the Bishop Arts District. There's a lot of really beautiful, great neighborhoods in this area. There's 3 transit stations. And so we're already beginning to see development pressure move into the area. On top of that, there are those 3 DART stations where not only is there city policy to have development near transit and an articulated land use vision for all of our DART stations, we also know that these are areas that developers are interested in building in. So it's really important to have a community-driven vision for these areas, to have a land use vision that aligns with what the community wants to see there. And then maybe most importantly, this is an area of the city that's never had any sort of existing land use or vision guide. So the goals for this area plan, like all area plans, are to establish a future land use map, that land development vision, which will be incorporated into Forward Dallas. Also to, as I mentioned, have the visioning and the engagement that was conducted through this 2-year process inform those authorized hearings. Also to identify any street and park improvements that may be needed in the area so that those can be included in future capital improvement projects and future bonds. And also identify any other priorities related to land development that aren't captured in those first 3. And just briefly, I do want to touch on, this idea of a future land use map. A future land use map is not a zoning map. It doesn't change the zoning. It's not a mandate for development or redevelopment. And it doesn't change any of the property rights that exist on that property. That can only occur through the authorized hearing process. It's simply a guide for future decisions about zoning and infrastructure. And the place types that are described in the future land use map you'll see in a few slides are intended to help guide development over the next several decades. So throughout this process, the community has been at the center of the entire process. We've had 14 public meetings, both virtually and in person, and then 15 other meetings with the communities, whether it was meeting with neighborhood associations or other sort of workshops. We held 3 different surveys throughout the process. I should mention that all of our engagement was conducted bilingually to ensure that there was an equitable approach to engaging a community that we know is largely Hispanic, and at least 50% of the residents, English is not their primary language. Also, an important part of this process was the council member appointed task force. This had representatives from each of the neighborhood associations in West Oak Cliff, and also a few other representatives and property owners. That group met 16 times over the course of 26 months, and they were really instrumental in providing guidance and shaping the plan, whether it was how and where we were engaging, or ultimately what the draft recommendations looked like. City staff, including myself, we were responsible for facilitating the task force meetings, providing the task force with relevant information and data so that they could make effective decisions. We organized all of the community engagement, and then our role was also to synthesize everything that we heard from the community and turn those into the recommendations that ultimately are in the draft plan. And then the elected officials, so that would be Councilmember Chad West and Commissioner Popkin. The council member was responsible for appointing the task force and for initiating the process, and both the commissioner and the council member are assisting in the plan adoption process. So without going into all the names, you can just see here is the 16-member task force, and you've got the representatives from all of the neighborhood associations. The task force was chaired by former Plan Commissioner Mike Anglin. So over the course of the 2-year process, 2020, we really started by scoping and launching the plan. 2021 was very heavy on engagement. We started area-wide to get an idea of what the community wanted to see for the entire area, and then we drilled down as we identified some key focus areas to establish and craft a very detailed land use vision on. And then in 2022, we've been using that time to draft the plan and then have engage the community to ensure that what's in the draft plan aligns with what they want to see. Critical throughout this entire process has been community engagement. This is just a more detailed version of that schedule. So I do want to touch briefly on our engagement process. Overall, this is one of the more comprehensive and robust engagement efforts that the city's ever done from an area planning perspective. We've had almost 7,800 touch points, and we define a touch point as people who attended a meeting, surveys completed, people who interacted with our online website. And I just wanted to show this that to put in perspective, the 360 plan, which was adopted in 2017, had 1,500 touch points, and that's an area that's 30 square miles, so it's 6 times the size of West Oak Cliff. So very robust engagement. As I mentioned, all of our meetings were conducted bilingually, whether we had translators available or we had all of our materials that we were either on boards or passed out were available in both Spanish and English. We had nearly 1,000 people attend our meetings, and several thousand people interact with our online website. And that interactive website was through a tool called Social Pinpoint, which was really helpful, especially during the pandemic, because it allowed people to have an interactive map that they could add data and information onto, and really helped inform the process, and is going to be a great tool just moving forward into the future for all area planning efforts. As soon as we were safely able to do so, we moved engagement in person, outdoors. I definitely think that helped to break down some barriers and allow for conversations to occur more naturally. It helped break down some of the language barriers that existed, and establish some more trust. So these meetings occurred throughout 2021. When we released the draft plan to the public in March of this year, we had both an online and an in-person meeting where we just presented the information of what was in the draft plan and collected feedback. To supplement that, we also had 2 pop-up events at local Hispanic grocery stores, because we know that historically the Hispanic community has been difficult to engage on planning efforts. And so we really wanted to make a concerted effort to meet people where they are and help answer questions, pass out surveys, and just generally inform the community about the plan so that they could provide us more input. And on top of all of that, we also mailed out 8,000 bilingual postcards through DISD, so that every kid went home with a postcard so that their families could learn more about the plan and either go online or go to the local rec center and get more information and give us their input. So overall, we had about 300 people complete that survey about the draft plan. 81% live in West Oak Cliff, 40% work in West Oak Cliff, and about 62% of the respondents are Hispanic. So I'll kind of blow through this quickly because I do know that we're short on time. We started with some planning goals that were crafted by our task force, things that they thought were the priorities. Using that as a starting point, and through engaging the community, we were able to elicit the plan values and vision statement for the West Oak Cliff area plan. And then what we heard from the community, really everything began to fall into 4 main buckets, which was land use and development, inclusive community development and quality of life, parks and open space, and transportation and infrastructure. So I'm not going to read through these, but this is the vision statement and the values, and all of this can be found in the executive summary and in the draft document. So just touching briefly on those draft recommendations, for each of the 4 frameworks, we had a vision map that identified kind of a list of priority projects and things that the community had highlighted that they'd like to see. And in addition to that, we also identified 4 main objectives. Each framework section has an implementation matrix, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I'm not going to go through each of these objectives for the sake of time, and I'm happy to go back to those if there's questions. But the goal was really to identify the key objectives for each of these 4 topics. I will say on inclusive community development and quality of life, some of the main concerns definitely related to concerns about neighborhood affordability, displacement, and gentrification. That's something that was a huge part of the entire process and the plan, as well as concerns about preservation of existing businesses and supporting local businesses. For transportation and infrastructure, we have a framework for a bike network in the area, as well as other street improvements. All of those will then go to our transportation and public works departments to be implemented as projects. Many of the sidewalk projects that were identified score very well for the sidewalk master plan. So we're hopeful that many of those will begin construction in the coming years. And then lastly, here's the land use and development vision. This is that future land use map. And so you can see those 5 different place types that were identified in West Oak Cliff. And it's important that these 5 place types, the goal is for these 5 place types to align as closely as possible with the draft place types that are currently being written for Forward Dallas, so that this future land use map can just become a detailed component that fits into the future land use map for the entire city through Forward Dallas. I will highlight that the 4 main objectives for land use and development were to preserve and protect existing single-family neighborhoods, promote transit-oriented development, create walkable neighborhood scale mixed use centers, and preserve historic buildings and character. Through this process, we did also identify 7 focus areas. These aligned a great deal with the existing authorized hearings that I talked about, but we also captured some other areas that were near transit and some commercial corridors where we know that there is development pressure. So for each one, we kind of did different things. We either did some urban design diagrams and had some recommendations. We did some before and afters of what some improvements might look like in these areas. And for each one, we also had, just like with each framework, we had an implementation matrix. So this had an action item, a time frame for implementation, a lead agency and support agencies for implementation, and any sources of funding that might be needed. And the goal of this is really to have a measurable outcome, so we can report and be able to keep track of what's been accomplished, what hasn't, so that we can keep the community up to date as to how implementation is going after adoption. So here are those 5 authorized hearings that I mentioned earlier. They go back as far as November of 2017, with the most recent one being from September of 2019. So some of these areas have been waiting nearly 5 years to have their authorized hearing processed, and that's simply due to the fact that we're working to get this area plan complete. As soon as the area plan is adopted, those authorized hearings will be able to move forward. I do want to briefly touch on the fact that for the vast majority of West Oak Cliff, we're not recommending any sort of changes at all to zoning or land use. That's for 63% of the area. For 37% of the area, we're recommending some changes, but those changes are very minor. When you break that down, only 2% of that area is any sort of change that would be for commercial or mixture of use or mixed use. And those are all of the focus areas that I already talked about. These are areas that are already commercial corridors, but are currently zoned CR. And the idea is simply to allow for a greater mixture of uses, including some residential. Additionally, in terms of the residential areas where we're recommending any sort of changes, these are single family areas that we're recommending some additional missing middle housing types be considered through future authorized hearings. So that might be accessory dwelling units in certain areas, or accessory dwelling units in duplexes. That is the vast majority of the recommendations are for either only allowing ADUs or ADUs and duplexes. In terms of any other more intense use, which is triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage courts, we're only recommending those to occur on large lots in single family areas, and that's less than 2% of the total land area of West Oak Cliff. So it's a very small percentage of the overall area that we're recommending any sort of change. And as part of that, we're also recommending that they have strict design guidelines so that they fit into the neighborhood context seamlessly. As I did mention, this plan has gone to Comprehensive Land Use Committee 4 times over the course of the last couple months. A few weeks back, the club committee made a motion that was passed that essentially added some recommendations to be amended in the document. And the plan that you have, the most recent plan that was shared with this committee, does have those changes included. That includes removing references to auto-centric businesses, some refinements and recommendations around missing middle housing, and also having a time frame in a framework for reevaluating the plan over time and sharing that information with the public, as well as with commissions and boards such as this one. Staff does have one additional recommendation that we'd like to recommend for amendment in the draft document. On page 122 in the Tyler Vernon Station area, this is an area where we are recommending some missing middle housing. While we did hear some support for that missing middle housing through engagement, there is still some opposition in that community. And so we wanted to amend the language specifically to address that. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read through each of these changes, but I will say that I'll kind of read the last few sentences because I think it's important. It is worth noting that while the area plan is recommending considerations for additional missing middle housing choices in this area, there is some expressed opposition by various community members towards this recommendation, as highlighted by surveying conducted by local community organizers. While their survey highlighted some support for additional housing choices, the majority of surveyed residents only support single-family homes and accessory dwelling units. So we just wanted to ensure that the language in the plan aligned with what the community's concerns were. So in terms of next steps, some of the key takeaways we had, as with all planning processes, establishing trust and building relationships was critical. This is an area that's never had any planning work done, and it's also an area that has seen other areas of the city, detrimentally impacted by bad planning decisions. And so there was a lot of concern that this was just another example of the city coming in with the intent to redevelop and gentrify and push out. And so it was really critical to establish trust and communicate that that is not the intent. As a part of that, it was also really important to work with neighborhoods to build neighborhood capacity and create new neighborhood associations, which isn't just important for area planning, but also important for all city processes so that we can get the word out and have a better network on the ground to spread information. And then lastly, and most importantly, equity was critical throughout this process, whether it was translation of documents and having bilingual meetings, or working with community groups to come up with creative, out of the box ways to get information out to the public. It was really important that equity and engaging the entire West Oak Cliff community was a part of this endeavor. We have begun to receive letters of support from local neighborhood associations. And staff's recommendation is for approval with suggested additional changes in addition to any requested comments of the shared draft of the West Oak Cliff Area Plan by this commission in order to advance the plan for review and adoption by City Council. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions in the time that remains.
Thank you very much, Mr. Church. Commissioners, let's take questions on the other side of the hearing. We'll go ahead and conclude our briefing now. It is 1:30 p.m. and that concludes the briefing of the Dallas City Plan Commission. Mr. King, let us know when we're ready to go for the hearing.
We're ready to go now.
Thank you very much, sir. Ms. Williams, can you please start us off with a roll call?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. District 1. District 2.
Present.
Present. District 4.
Present.
District 5.
Present.
District 6. District 7. District 8.
Present.
District 9.
District 9 is present.
District 10.
Present.
District 11. District 12.
Present.
District 13.
Present.
District 14. District 15.
I'm here.
Thank you very much. We do have a quorum. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today is Thursday, July 21st, 2022, 1:31 p.m. Welcome to the Dallas City Plan Commission. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. Our speaker guidelines, each speaker will receive 3 minutes. Ms. Williams will keep time, and she will let you know when your time is up. On cases where we do have opposition, per our rules, the applicant will receive a 2-minute rebuttal. And then also our rules allow us to adjust the speaker time on a case-by-case basis, and that will happen today on 2 cases. On cases number Z167395, the Elm Thicket case, each speaker will receive 1 minute. And also on the West Oak Cliff Area Plan, each speaker will receive 1 minute. Also, I believe that there's some yellow cards right behind Ms. Pham there on a little table. Please, if you would, at some point, make sure you fill one of those out. We'd love to have a record of your visit with us here today. And with that, Commissioners, we'll come back now to Mr. Church and questions for him. Commissioner Young.
Yes, I note that at several points in the document, you refer to incorporation of an appropriate residential proximity slope. What is an appropriate residential proximity slope?
Yeah, so excellent question. That will be determined through those authorized hearing processes. in terms of what the specific ratio is, the starting point would be the current RPS slope, which is 1/3. If through the authorized hearing process and through engagement and notification out to all property owners, it's determined to be something different, then the zoning will reflect that, or the recommendation for the authorized hearing would reflect that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Housewright.
Mr. Church, in your slides a moment ago, there was a slide noting support from homeowner associations. I believe there were 6 listed on the slide. In the full-length report, the 89-page report available to us, when you get to the very end, I count 3 letters of support from homeowners associations. I don't know if those overlap with the 6 on your slide or if they're different, but my question is, how many homeowners associations do you estimate are present inside of this plan?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So there's no HOAs, but there are 11 neighborhood associations. So of the 3 that are in the document that was shared with you, we've received 3 letters in the last few days, and so the document online just hasn't been updated to reflect that. And I'm happy to share those letters with this commission as requested. And I'll also we'll make updates to the document online. So of the 6 that have submitted letters of support, that's 6 of the 11. It is also worth noting that some of those neighborhood associations are more organized than others, but we've been in communications with all of the neighborhood associations, and we had a representative from each neighborhood association on the task force throughout the process.
Mr. Church, do you know if any of those neighborhood associations or representatives will be present today?
I know that Commissioner Anglin is signed up to speak as chair of the task force. And I also know that Elena Stevens, who represented the Elmwood Neighborhood Association, I believe that she is signed up to speak as well. I'm not sure if there's any other representatives from the task force. I'd have to check the list of speakers.
Commissioner Carpenter.
Yes, Mr. Church, one of those neighborhood associations is listed on your slide of being in support, sent a letter basically retracting the support that I know was sent to me, and I distributed it this morning, that expressing some serious reservations about the staff recommendation for the missing middle housing. You may not be aware of that, but yes, if we could get copies of all of those letters of support, I would like to get those.
Absolutely, yeah, we're happy to provide those.
Commissioner Stanner. Oh, no, I thought I saw you reaching in that. Commissioner Anderson, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How many business associations were conferred with during the making of this area plan?
So there's not a we've been working with the Automotive Association of West Oak Cliff in the last few months, in the recent weeks, to ensure that the recommendations in the Hampton Clarendon area and the downtown Elmwood area are those that they can support. That said, through our engagement effort, we did not find any well-established business associations in West Oak Cliff. And actually, one of our recommendations in the area plan is to create a business task force for the businesses in West Oak Cliff so that they can have kind of a more cohesive, organized approach and have a group that can effectively network and engage with the chambers of commerces and engage with the city so that they can better set themselves up for the future.
Is it appropriate to think that they should be involved in the ratification of an area plan as opposed to being on the opposite end after it were to pass or be presented? So
yes, I mean, our job is to balance the community's input and as well as property owners. Anything that would be recommended in terms of changes of zoning through the authorized hearing would obviously notify those business owners. In terms of notifying out to every individual property owner or getting in touch with every business, that was something that we just didn't have the budget or capacity to undertake because there's thousands of commercial properties in this area, and many of them are out-of-state owners. At the same time, we worked with on the ground neighborhood association and other individuals to help spread the word, not only to residents but also to business owners in the area.
I think there are more
Commissioner, can you please speak into your microphone so we can capture your questions? Thank you.
Yes. Would you say there are more residences in the area than businesses? And I'm only saying that because I think that the automotive businesses were kind of called out in the area plan, and I'm looking for if there was engagement on businesses overall in order to see where they might want it to stand in the area plan.
So there are substantially more residences than businesses. This is an area that has about 44,000 residents and only about 3,500 jobs. Over 80% of the land area of West Oak Cliff is residential. So the vast majority of West Oak Cliff is not commercial. That said, the recommendations that initially had been in the draft that was released in March that speak to auto-centric businesses, those have been removed at the request of the club committee. At the same time, we have been engaging as needed with businesses in the area and property owners of those commercial properties. But the most important part of our engagement has been with those neighborhoods, since they do make up over 80% of the West Oak Cliff area.
I think there's opportunity, and being a question, there's opportunity at creating or listening to the businesses and what they might want as a part of this overall business plan. I mean, I know there are thousands of residences and there are hundreds of businesses, so that seems like that would be something that we could kind of get our hands around. My next question, and I'll pose it as one question: education, institutions, and transit for DART. How robust was your conversations with those two?
Yeah, so we had multiple meetings with DISD, and we worked with the trustee actually to help us get the engagement out through the students in the local schools. So we did work with DISD because we also know it's important, not just through this area plan, but from Forward Dallas as well, that if we're talking about increasing density anywhere in the city, it's important to be thinking of what are the impacts on the school system? How is that going to change the number of classrooms that might be needed in an area? So we had those conversations, and we'll continue to have those conversations with DISD moving forward. In terms of working with DART, we had multiple ongoing meetings with both their bus network team as well as with their real estate and capital improvements team, because during this process, that's when DART changed their bus route system. And so it was really important to ensure that the changes to the network would be reflective in our plan, and that if they were doing anything that might potentially change land use impacts, we wanted to capture that. At the same time, there's also recommendations for development at the Hampton DART station, because there's a large parking lot there that largely sits unused. And so DART has expressed interest and is working with the city to release an RFP for a public-private partnership for development there. And so we had ongoing work with DART on that, and continue to have a strong relationship with them in the West Oak Cliff area as well as other areas of the city.
Thank you. It'd be good to see the evidence of those conversations so that we could kind of discern what direction or what concerns they had relative to what you guys are presenting in the plan. And also, lastly, you mentioned that the area is mostly residential with only a certain number of businesses. And my thoughts are that the area plan is an opportunity to evaluate just that and determine what the proper balance is and be able to make recommendations to that end. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for entertaining my questions, and thank you, Mr. Staff, for also entertaining the questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Blair.
In your presentation, you showed that there was a percentage of ADUs that was being recommended. And is that that would be in single family, existing single family uses, correct?
Yes, that is correct. The recommendation was to, in areas within a quarter mile of the Jefferson bus line, which is the busiest bus line in the entire network, as well as within a half mile of the Hampton DART station and the Tyler Vernon DART station, to in residential, single family residentially zoned properties, which are R5 and R75, to permit accessory dwelling units by right. But that would require that to occur through some sort of future authorized hearing or zoning change.
So, and I think that's where, I think you were thinking about where I'm going, because isn't in our zoning standards for single family ADUs aren't permitted? Is that not correct?
They're permitted through Board of Adjustment action. And so one of our recommendations actually is it's either to create a new infill zoning category, infill residential zoning category, since we know that this is something that will need to be an issue addressed citywide. There's also neighborhoods in these areas that have expressed interest in creating a conservation district. And so permitting those additional housing types can be done through the conservation district process or some sort of a zoning overlay. Either way, we know it's going to require some sort of a code amendment to make that occur.
So how would you protect the communities that do not have this advantage or this opportunity to not see systematic use of this process to mitigate the zoning standards in other areas of the city?
You know, our area plan only focuses specifically on West Oak Cliff, and we do know that some of the recommendations that are outlined in the area plan might be topics that Forward Dallas aims to address as well. And so I think that some of those citywide issues are best handled or will be best handled by Forward Dallas. In terms of areas that are outside of these areas within West Oak Cliff specifically, we don't make any specific recommendations against permitting accessory dwelling units by right, or for permitting accessory dwelling units by right, or any other residential choice housing type. A property owner, like any other area of the city, could still go through the Board of Adjustment process if they wanted to do that. And if a neighborhood in the future is interested in seeking some sort of a change to the zoning to have ADUs be permitted, then they could do that. But that's not something that we heard through this process, and so we didn't include that in the plan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Carpenter.
Yes, my question is about the page in your presentation that said that believe it was 67% of the single family neighborhoods would not be affected by your recommendations for more density. 33% would, but the effect would be minor. My question is about, could you please evaluate the potential for destabilizing a single family neighborhood through fundamentally altering the pattern of the neighborhood? Because it seems to me that if you change the zoning to the point that, you can introduce these different types of density, then, you would have a potential for future platting cases and seeing that, 8.503 would no longer apply because there isn't a pattern because you fundamentally altered it. So how would that be a minor effect?
So the platting portion is something that we know that the specifics are definitely important to determine through that future code amendment and or that future authorized hearing to consider changing the zoning in these areas. The area plan is purely a starting point for that conversation to say that considering some additional density near transit is something that the city as a policy has adopted council policies to achieve. There's also interest in the community to consider that. And additionally, we know that by having a diversity of housing choice options, it also helps to have a diversity of housing price options. And this is an area where we know affordability is a concern. So having some more affordable product type is going to be really important. In terms of preserving the character or ensuring that it doesn't fundamentally alter the neighborhood, the document has multiple pages in it that speak to what a potential missing middle overlay or some recommendations might look like in terms of keeping, ensuring that the form and massing and height of any of these structures is identical to what currently exists in the R75 zoning. And so the goal is to, we know that today somebody could come in, tear down one of these small homes and build a very massive 40% lot coverage house by right, but it can only have one kitchen. And so what we're saying is we can strategically, through a potential future zoning change, consider, thinking about ways that we ensure that that any new development is fits contextually in terms of height and massing, but also maybe is allowed to have more than one unit in it, those being smaller units. A duplex that instead of a 2,500 square foot house, it could be two 1,200 square foot units. That begins to allow for some diversity of price points in a neighborhood that we know desperately needs it.
I understand that, but as far as fundamentally altering the lot patterns, the recommendation in the report is that, lots of a certain size, say 6,000 square feet, could be subdivided into two 3,000 square foot lots with, 30-foot widths. And then it goes the other way, that lots of a certain size bigger could be automatically, fourplexes, cottage homes, something like that. What are you envisioning in an overlay that would allow that sort of either subdivision or aggregation that would not fundamentally alter the pattern of a single family neighborhood when confronted with, future platting requests to either go smaller or bigger?
So, one of the main items are around the Tyler Vernon Station area. It's a very unique development pattern. There are some areas like the Elmwood, which has a bunch of 7,500 square foot lots that have a very regular block pattern. But then there's other areas that are either previously aggregated over time and replatted, or they were just always large, because we have some lots that are within a block or two of the DART station that are over 2 acres in size. And those are the lots that we specifically know there's opportunities on long-term to think about some additional housing types to be allowed there. We wouldn't want to preclude the ability for that lot to be, if a 2-acre lot wants to be subdivided so that they can have a series of quadplexes that architecturally fit into the neighborhood, that's something that aligns with city policy. At the same time, in areas that have existing, an existing fabric of R75 zoning, the vast majority of those, we're not even recommending any changes to be considered there, except for allowing duplexes to be considered. And as part of that, our recommendation is that we have strict architectural guidelines so that we don't get the duplexes that have 2 garages and 2 driveways out front, but instead are ones that contextually fit into the neighborhood and feel like single family homes. In terms of, what 8.503 could do, that's something that really has to be determined through the zoning process and through that code amendment. And it's not something that the area plan can specifically outline, because it's too early. This is a starting point for a vision. It's not the details of the code.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Rubin.
Yes, thank you. I think Commissioner Carpenter brings up a good point about the intersection between platting and zoning. And even though that's not the issue being directly addressed in the area plan, it's several chess moves down the board, or even another chess game where we're eventually going to have to confront that. So you're looking at me, Ms. Pham, so you might be the one to address this. But let's just assume that we have a area that is R75 and every lot in the area is actually 7,500 square feet. But then some sort of infill zoning category comes along and that area is rezoned, and that zoning category does allow smaller lots. Would that mere change of zoning category in and of itself change the 8.503 analysis, or is it actually the change? Would it have to be changes in lot sizes themselves to alter our 8.503
That's a very interesting question, and I will need some time to research that and get back with you at a
Yeah.
later date.
That would be great. I know it's something some of us has thrown around and are really just trying to figure out what that impact would be.
Commissioner Young.
Yes, I want to drill down on the word consider. Repeatedly through the plan, the land use and development recommendations say, consider this, consider that. Are those just a list of topics for discussion when each individual authorized hearing comes up? Or does the plan recommend not only consideration but adoption?
So the plan only recommends consideration. We know whether it's city plan commission or city council, it will require one of those two bodies to authorize a hearing for a geography to move forward. And the recommendations that are outlined in the area plan would serve as a starting point for when city staff processes that authorized hearing. They would come to the public and say, the area plan said this, so this is what that would look like in terms of a zoning change, and then have public engagement to ensure, is that accurate? Is that not at all what the community wants to see? Maybe opinions have changed. Adoption it doesn't recommend adoption of those. It's only consideration. And it would be to this body and to city council to ultimately recommend adoption.
Well, but I hear you saying some conflicting things. It's not just, here are a list of things to talk about. We're totally neutral on what happened. Now let's talk about them. What you're telling me is it's a list of things to talk about, and there's sort of a thumb on the scales in the sense of we start with a baseline of what is suggested in the area plan. Is that accurate? And obviously what the commission and council do is the ultimate final word. But you indicated that staff would start with what the area plan recommends. Is that right?
That is correct.
So you are recommending, for example, that within a half mile of the DART stations, missing middle housing be permitted?
That is correct. That aligns with city policy, and then it also aligns with what a lot of voices in the community told us.
Well, and we'll see the extent to which that is true or not. Shifting to the cottage homes, do I understand correctly if an area, let's say, typically has a half acre, is zoned R5 or R75, but the lots are typically a half acre, that would permit 8 dwelling units per single family lot?
Yes, that's correct. That's what we have outlined in the area plan as kind of a guide for a future zoning change.
That is more dense than TH3, is that right?
I'd have to go check the code, but
take my word for it, it's 12 dwelling units an acre. And it's almost as much as cluster housing, which is 18, is that right?
Again, I'd have to check the code to know the exact dwelling units, but I'd take you at your word.
All right. Now turning to the narrow lot single family. I notice your report indicates that the narrow lot single family houses would be either on the same lot or on skinny lots. If it were the same lot, then it would be correct, would it not be, that that is not what is defined as single family housing in the development code?
That is correct. The idea
that
is
would in
essentially to
fact
have
be in effect a detached duplex.
That is correct.
Okay. And if it were on separate lots, that would require replatting and compliance with 8.503 would be required.
Yeah, that's my understanding. That's correct.
Okay. Last question about accessory dwelling units. That issue, of course, is before ZOAC, which may recommend no change to current regulations or may recommend a radical change or something halfway in between. Is there the potential for your land use study recommending something that is inconsistent with what ZOAC ultimately recommends and the commission and council ultimately adopt for accessory dwelling units?
It is possible. Our goal has been to ensure that the plan aligns with whether it's parking recommendations or some of these other recommendations around accessory dwelling units, that we're working with those other planners who are processing those to make sure that they're as in great of alignment as possible. And hopefully Forward Dallas will kind of be the master document that will speak to all of this. But depending on timing, it is possible that ours could recommend what's in there today, and then ZOAC and CPC and council could recommend something different. That is possible.
And even perhaps ZOAC recommends something different.
Correct.
Okay. And are you suggesting that Forward Dallas amendments are going to address the issue of accessory dwelling units?
Yeah, there's a lot of topics that Forward Dallas aims to address, and I think that it's too early to know what the content is going to be in Forward Dallas, but we know that it's one of many topics that are potentially going to be included in that plan.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Blair?
Is it my understanding, I hear a lot of Forward Dallas making new recommendations, ADUs being determined to be applicable in this area plan, and some of the other things. Is it the intent to, in this particular area plan, to bypass the processes that are in place today to ensure that the entire city is operating within the standards of zoning that we understand in 51A by using the area plan process to make new zoning definitions, new lot coverage, new opportunities for additional housing stock, based on whatever definition you determine in this particular area plan, opposed to coming through the appropriate process of coming through ZOAC for ZOAC to recommend, coming through this particular body for the body to agree or disagree, and then going to city council before new zoning stock and new zoning definitions are codified into an ordinance?
The goal is not to subvert that or go around that. This is purely to capture the vision of a community into a document that serves as a starting point, and then any sort of amendments to code or zoning changes through an authorized hearing would have to go through all of the formalized processes that they already would. And it might be recommended that none of the recommendations that are in the area plan make sense, or some of them make sense and some of them don't. And that's for ZOAC and CPC and council to decide. This is purely to capture the vision that a community has for land use moving the next 20 or 30 years into the future.
But are you not actually trying to make those recommendations based on the fact, talking about ADUs? ADUs have specific rules, talking about having replats that are going to be difficult to do a replat if you have one unit and you have two units on one plat, and now you want to replat it and it has to go through a building. So isn't that essentially what this recommendation is doing, is altering the process through the area plan process?
You know, again, it's just a starting point to just outline what long-term development looks like. It's the same processes would have to be followed. It's a recommendation, and maybe the recommendation I mean, it can be seen as consideration to reimagine our parts of our code. But again, those would still have to go through all of the same formal channels that exist today.
Vice Chair Rubin.
Just a couple follow-up questions. First off, it's been a while since I've dug into the ADU regulations that are currently on code. I sat through some of those ZOAC meetings probably at the beginning of the pandemic. You've mentioned the Board of Adjustment process for allowing ADUs right now. Are there additional ways to get ADUs into an area, right, through conservation districts or PDs? That's another way to adopt ADUs at the moment for an area, correct?
That is correct. There are other ways. You know, conservation districts are definitely a tool. I've never seen a PD do that, but it certainly could.
Okay. Great. And just one sort of process question about Forward Dallas and area plans. What is the relationship between the upcoming Forward Dallas rewrite and area plans like WOCAP and others that are in the process? Does one trump the other? Are they somehow, do they interface? Can you just walk through that relationship?
Sure, I'll take a stab, and I'll let my assistant director Andrea hop on and add as well. You know, the idea is that the future land use map that I showed on one of those slides, that will essentially plug into the future land use map for the entire city like a puzzle piece, and that the recommendations that are outlined in West Oak Cliff will align and jive with Forward Dallas, and that one does not trump the other. The West Oak Cliff area plan will have a more detailed vision for the area that maybe not every area of the city is going to have because they don't have a current area plan. But it's simply a supplement to, not any sort of contradiction or contrary to. I hope that makes sense.
Do you have anything to add, Ms. Gillis?
Sure. And so this is a little unique because we have the area plan happening first, and then the comprehensive plan will come after that. Any subsequent plan so say we have Forward Dallas in place, any plan that comes after that will then be an amendment to the city's comprehensive plan. So we will make sure if there are any changes that area plan or neighborhood plan that would recommend, it would be agreed upon through that process. And then once adopted, it becomes an amendment and updating of the comprehensive plan.
Great. And Mr. Church mentioned a future land use map, which may or may ultimately not make it into the final Forward Dallas document. Assuming it does that future land use map dictate zoning, or is that just one thing to consider as rezoning's happening?
Exactly. It's a guide for zoning. It does not dictate absolute, because within land use, there's a range of options that you can usually look at for zoning classifications. So it doesn't dictate a one for one, but it is one of the guides, a strong guide that is used for looking at zoning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Church and Ms. Gillis.
Commissioner Hampton.
Thank you. I share many of the comments and questions that were asked by my fellow commissioners, so I won't repeat all of those. I think there's a lot here to digest. I will tell you, as I was trying to read it, the first thing that occurred to me is how fantastic it would be if we could have a bus tour of this area. I hope that's something that we might consider as we look to take action on this in the future. And I simply wanted to observe for Mr. Church that you might look at the Cedars as an example of a PD that included accessory dwelling units within it. So I think, and we likely have others, but I do know that is one recent one where we were able to include that. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ms. Gillis, and Mr. Church.
Thank you, Commissioner Hampton. And yes, the bus tour is in the works. So we hope to have that at our next meeting or our second in August. Commissioner Popkin.
Just a couple follow-up questions on the conversation we've been having. Mr. Church, I know there's been a lot of conversation about large lots. Did a size limitation make it into the final draft? I'm still reading the complete draft.
There is not a recommendation currently in the plan for a maximum lot size or lot dimensions.
Okay. let's continue that conversation because I definitely want to keep talking with you about that. I think that's one of the greatest concerns is if we've got some missing middle qualified as enough too that it could turn into larger garden style apartments. Also, was there any conversation with the community about ADUs throughout the district, or was it primarily limited to around the stations? I know there are a lot of ADUs in this historic neighborhood already.
There are some existing accessory dwelling units, and we mostly while we started area wide, whenever we drilled down into the station areas specifically, we didn't have conversations about accessory dwelling units for the entire area. We did hear, a small handful of individuals who definitely expressed interest in saying, why not ADUs for the entire area? Obviously that would require consideration for changing all of the zoning in all of West Oak Cliff. But if that's something that is, there's interest in, then it obviously could be included in the plan, but it was not something that we engaged the entire West Oak Cliff area about.
Okay, so simply just because of the size and nature of the plan, it's really 5 square miles. That'd be a different type of zoning change to really cover the full area with ADUs. Okay. And lastly, I recognize that this is a huge plan. I want to make sure I give commissioners plenty of time to review all the details. You guys have been working on this for 2 years. We've had some really in-depth conversations the last 6 months at least, tightening up some of these details with different community groups. And I encouraged community members to continue signing up to speak at our August 4th meeting. And I don't plan to make a motion until the 18th. Hopefully we can get a bus tour before then. I know today's docket is especially long, and so I encouraged community members to show up and speak at these later meetings rather than feeling like they need to stick around until all hours of the night tonight. But what are your next steps, Mr. Church, in engaging especially the Elmwood community? I know they're actively bringing in more members into their HOA as we speak. Is engagement continuing on this plan right now?
It is, so ultimately the draft in its current form, staff is not making any additional changes to the document. It's really to City Plan Commission and City Council to recommend those changes. The only additional changes that we would be making would be adding in those letters of support that have come in but have not found their way into the document yet. As requested, we're continuing to meet with neighborhood associations and anybody who requests a meeting. So we're more than happy to have those ongoing conversations, to hear everybody's voice and ensure that everybody is comfortable with the plan.
Great, and I just want to reassure everyone, I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for community members to read this final document. And I encourage community members listening to reach out to me and make sure that we've got any final changes necessary to make this really reflective of the neighbor's vision into the document before we get it to council. So I anticipate we'll be speaking more about the plan in the following 2 meetings, and I look forward to more questions from commissioners and the community. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really quickly, just kind of generally.
Commissioner Anderson, the mic.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. In the future, on our subsequent meetings, could you outline where we're meeting certain sustainable communities, guidelines, and initiatives, and or what touch points they may have towards those kinds of initiatives? And then also, are there areas, and not to be answered right now, that can be improved in this area plan process so that we're more efficient for the other area plans that are to come? Thank you.
Yeah, on the first item, yes, I think that the main thing that we can do is highlight where recommendations that are in the plan align with other adopted city policies, such as our climate action plan, because I think that the climate action plan is a really great plan that not only is guiding some of the recommendations that are in West Oak Cliff, as well as other areas of the city. In terms of process for area plans moving forward, one thing that occurred during this planning process was we started in May of 2020 in the height of the pandemic, and I know that future area plans hopefully will not have those same kinds of challenges. And we definitely had to navigate some difficult situations from an engagement perspective. But in terms of coming up with a more streamlined approach, I definitely think that this process, we learned some lessons, and I know that those processes and approaches will be incorporated, and PUD will take those into consideration into our future area plans so that we can shave off some time and that these processes don't take quite so long.
Thank you. Any other questions, commissioners? Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Church.